Hello, my name is Dr. Joanne Bazubitz, and I am proud to be President and CEO of the Royal, one of Canada's leading mental health and research centres where clients receive best-in-class care informed by cutting-edge research so that they may live their best lives. I would like to thank Rogers TV for the opportunity to host our conversations at the Royal, where you will hear from many of our amazing clinicians and researchers who are passionate about the care they provide and the research that will lead to novel treatments and new discoveries in mental health and addictions. Today's session is about sleep, whether you're getting enough of it or not sure, and why it can impact your mental health and your well-being. Dr. Rébecca Robillard directs clinical sleep research at the Royal's Research Institute, and as assistant professor, she also co-directs the sleep lab at the School of Psychology at the University of Ottawa. Dr. Robillard holds a PhD in clinical neuropsychology and has obtained national awards for her work in psychiatric sleep, chronobiology, which we will learn about today. Dr. Robillard has also been recognized at the Royal's Inspiration Awards as a young investigator and one of our emerging research innovators. At her young age, she has already published more than 36 scientific publications, contributing significantly to the understanding of sleep disturbances and mental disorders, and her latest research is about the interactions between mental illness, the sleeping brain, and the sleeping heart. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Robillard.
Thank you, Joanne. So it's a pleasure to come and talk about sleep with you today. Sleep often gets neglected in our busy lives. Many people are trying to live healthier lifestyles by carefully watching what they eat and taking care of exercising regularly, but we often take poor care of our sleep. And there's also this idea that sleep is an unproductive state, while in fact sleep is very important for a lot of mental health aspects of our lives, as well as physical health as well. So in this session, I hope that I'll be able to convince you of the importance of sleep for our mental well-being, notably by sharing some observations about what we saw during the pandemic through a recent research study. And then we'll also discuss some means of protecting and improving our sleep. So if we're about to talk about sleep and mental health right now, it's hard not to talk about the elephant in the room. All of us have been part of this very unfortunate and unusual experiment for the last year or so, as we've been trying to adapt to the COVID-19 pandemic situation. And through this difficult period, most of us have been facing major changes in our daily routine, in our social lives, and as well as in our work settings, not to mention all the pressure that's caused by economic uncertainties. And all of that is bound to have major effects on our mental health, but also on our sleep as well. So I see sleep as an important player in that equation because it is potentially something that we can modify, that we can actively act on to try to protect more and build up more resilience for mental health, because we know that better sleep enables us to cope better during the day with our daily challenges. So let me start by showing you some of the findings that we've observed in a sample of 5,000 Canadians who kindly shared their experiences with us as we were going through the first wave of the pandemic. And so when we compared symptoms of insomnia during the pandemic, which you can see here in darker blue, to retrospective estimates of how people were doing and sleeping in terms of before the pandemic, that you can see in lighter blue here, we saw that more people are having difficulties either falling asleep, maintaining their sleep, so tossing and turning in the middle of the night, and waking up too early in the morning. And overall, we saw that it's 1 person out of 2, or 50%, that is having significant symptoms of insomnia during the pandemic. So this represents a major rise in the prevalence of sleep problems compared to what we were seeing before the pandemic. Also, we were seeing that several people were increasing their sleeping medications, which might cause problems further down the track because of tolerance and dependence issues. In a nutshell, we know that in the longer term, when we're using these medications, the longer we use them, the higher doses that we need, up to a point where sometimes the medications are no longer effective. So because we're in this for the long term, it seems, the pandemic has been dragging on for quite some time now, and the new normal is kind of something that we need to adapt to. It's good to try to, rather than just relying on medication, trying to consider some more sustainable methods to try to protect and improve our sleep, and we'll get back to that a little bit later on. So we found in that study that some people were more at risk of increased stress and increased sleep problems during the pandemic. For example, we saw that individuals who had a chronic illness, those with pre-existing mental disorders, those who had an earlier wake-up schedule, and also women, younger individuals, people who are working, especially people who are working with the public, and people with more family responsibilities. And when I'm thinking about these kind of last few points, I can't help but see the image of that young woman who's at home trying to take care of the kids at the same time as she's trying to adapt her working schedule to working from home and taking care of the adaptations with the Zoom sessions, for example, when kids are kicked out of school because of issues with a classmate that has the COVID-19 or has been symptomatic. And so constantly on her feet to try to adapt to that situation, probably with less levels of support than what we had before the pandemic. And so certainly we're seeing that certain portion of the population is kind of affected by these new challenges a bit more heavily than others. We also saw that people who drink more alcohol, people who spend less time exercising and less time doing pleasurable activities, as well as those who spend more time watching television, are more at risk for worse stress and sleep problems. And I'm highlighting these last few points because these are things that we can actively control. So as we're reflecting on ways to try to protect and improve our sleep, these are good things to keep in mind. One important thing that we found in our research study so far is that not everyone is responding to the pandemic in the same way. We saw very different sleep profiles across different individuals. Although many people were having more problems sleeping, some people were actually sleeping better during the pandemic. And that might have to do with some of the aspects of confinement and the adjustments that we're having in our daily lives. For example, for those of us who are working from home and then not necessarily having to wake up that extra early in the morning to kind of commute and get stuck in traffic, those kind of new lifestyle that we're going through right now might represent some opportunity to catch back on our sleep and sleep in a little bit later in the morning. We know very well that a lot of the population was sleep deprived before the pandemic hit, just because of the kind of crazy lifestyles that we often live. And so some of the kind of adjustments that we're going through right now might be able to help enable some people to alleviate some of that pressure on our busy schedules. But that's not the case for everyone. We also saw a lot of people with sleeping difficulties. Globally, we saw 3 types of sleepers during the pandemic. There's what we call the late risers, so those who go to bed around the same time as before the pandemic, but wake up a tiny bit later in the morning, so they essentially increased their sleep window. And then there's the night owls who go to bed and wake up later, which led them to have a slight increase in their sleep window as well. But basically, their sleep changes were characterized by a delay in their sleep schedule. And there's also the short sleepers who go to bed later, but also wake up earlier in the morning, which basically means that they shortened their sleep window. And so one of the important thing is that the later 2 groups, so the night owls and the short sleepers, were the individuals that we saw that had the worst worsening in terms of their insomnia symptoms. So the key message here is that there are ways in which we changed our concrete behaviors towards sleep since the start of the pandemic, like staying up later, for example, which has direct impact on our ability to sleep and our sleep quality. So again, things that we can potentially control quite actively as well. And importantly, these different sleep profiles had very different psychological responses to the pandemic as well. So we saw here that what you can see here is the percentage of people who had meaningful worsening in stress, anxiety, and depression across the three sleep groups that we've just described. And so what you can see is that those with reduced sleep or delayed sleep patterns, so our short sleepers and our night owls that you can see here in the darker blue, had more severe worsening in all types of mental health outcomes. So worse increases in stress, worse increases in anxiety symptoms and depressive symptoms as well, when we compared them to those people who managed to maintain a better sleep schedule during the pandemic. And this kind of strongly aligns with what we know is a bidirectional relationship between how we sleep and how we regulate our emotions. So on the one side, changes in sleep can affect the brain centers which are involved in emotional regulation. It generates biases in when we don't sleep, it generates biases in how we process emotional information. It makes us more prone to ruminations. It alters our level of energy. All of this has downstream effects on how we feel, on our mood, and how irritable we might be. And on the flip side, when we don't feel that great during the daytime, of course, this can also influence our ability to sleep at night. And so this little cartoon here says it all. You should lie down and try to go to sleep so I can remind you of your problems. It's almost as if, as soon as we're kind of hitting the pillow, our brain is throwing at us all these worrisome negative thoughts that it can exactly at the time at which we would like it to shut down and leave us alone so that we can get some rest. A little bit like it was purposefully kind of stirring up the mud at that time when we're going to bed at night. And in a way, that's kind of what is happening if we look at what is happening at the biological level in the brain during the nighttime versus the daytime. So you might have heard about the amygdala, this structure that's deep inside the brain, which is heavily reactive to stress and emotion. There's also the frontal cortex, which is kind of the rational center of our brain, which helps us put things in perspective and make sense of our emotions. So during the daytime, the frontal cortex is actively inhibiting the activity in the amygdala, a little bit like a parent which is kind of trying to reassure a young child after they scratch their knees or something, just to let them know that everything's going to be okay, it'll heal up, and there's no drama there. So the frontal lobe is kind of having that kind of natural reassuring effect on the emotional centers of our brain. But what we see happening during the nighttime is that our frontal lobes are kind of winding down in terms of their activity. So they're becoming a little bit less active, while the amygdala, so the emotional center of our brain, stays pretty active. So that emotional part of our brain is kind of loose from its input from the rational part of our brain, so that worries and anxieties and fears are completely free to kind of expand and go astray, without us being able to kind of make a logical sense of it. So this is the perfect recipe for ruminating endlessly and just always having that little answer in the back of our mind, which is running away and kind of thinking, getting preoccupied about things that often doesn't kind of really matter that much, but we're not able to kind of think logically and kind of detract from that train of thoughts. So this is why the nighttime is the worst timing for most of us to try to problem solve. So your brain is literally not equipped to do the best job in terms of thinking rationally. So that's something helpful to kind of keep in mind as we're having issues sleeping during the night, if we're kind of waking up and having these kind of intrusive thoughts, to just try to acknowledge them, acknowledge the fact that it's normal that they're happening, put them aside on the bedside table and being reassured that they'll wait for us the next morning when we wake up. And the next morning, hopefully, we'll be better equipped to try to address these problems in a more rational way. And what happens if we do not sleep? Well, there are some studies that have shown that our amygdala becomes 60% more reactive to emotional stimulation. And there's some degree of disconnection between the amygdala and the frontal cortex. So that misbalance between our emotional and rational parts of our brain starts occurring as well during the daytime. So all in all, not sleeping enough kind of takes an active toll on our brain processing in terms of emotional stimuli that we're facing during the daytime. So it makes us more at risk of not handling kind of emotional situation in the optimal way. So to give you some hints about how and why this happens, at the physiological level, sleep is highly involved in a range of different restorative processes. And just to give you an example, 60% of our brain's cleaning is happening during sleep. And that's not just a metaphor. So it was recently discovered that during wake, there's a progressive accumulation of neurotoxins in the brain. The same types of processes that what we're seeing in Alzheimer's disease, for example, of course, to a lower degree in most of us. But that is a phenomenon that's associated with lower function in between brain cells, for example, and more difficulties with our thinking skills and our memory, for example. It turns out that during sleep, the space in between brain cells expand, and this allows for the liquid that's inside our brain to kind of flush out all these neurotoxins much more efficiently. And this prepares our brain to be in a better state to function the next day. So we're kind of resetting that button, not just kind of metaphorically speaking, but in very concrete ways as well. So since we've seen that sleep is so important for a lot of aspects about our health, what can we do to protect and improve it? So there's several things that we can watch out for in our daily lifestyle. We know that's kind of stating the obvious that caffeine stimulates our nervous system. We often use coffee to try to, or tea or chocolate to try to kind of keep us alert and awake during the daytime. So of course, this is something that is going to have adverse effects on our sleep. But what people often don't take in account is the fact that caffeine stays in our system for quite some time, about 8 hours. So even the coffee or tea or piece of chocolate that you take in the afternoon will have an impact on your sleep. And we might not always kind of notice it because sometimes it has more subtle changes in our sleep architecture or on the depth of our sleep, but the effects are certainly there. Another kind of less intuitive one is smoking. We know that nicotine is actually a stimulant of the central nervous system. So even if it makes us feel more relaxed and less anxious, having a smoke before bedtime is not a good idea because you might be more relaxed, but you're also your brain is more wired and less in a state that's less conducive to sleep. Alcohol is another tricky one. I won't lie to you, it helps some people to fall asleep quicker. So it reduces the time it takes us to fall asleep. But, and that's a big but, the sleep that we get after that is of lower quality. So we get more disrupted sleep with more awakenings during the nighttime, even if we don't recall it, as well as shallower sleep as well. So alcohol is definitely not a good idea to try to improve our sleep. And if we have sleep problems or don't feel that refreshed the next day, it's a good thing to try to monitor our alcohol. Not to say that it's a definitely no, but just to be aware of the consequences that can have on our sleep. Another important point to highlight there with alcohol as well for those who might have this disorder called sleep apnea. So these difficulties breathing during the night, for which we might or might not be aware that we have this disorder. Alcohol is actually making sleep apnea worse, so creating some more difficulties in terms of breathing during the nighttime. Another point that I want to highlight is cardiovascular exercise. We know that this is one proactive, very helpful way of trying to improve our sleep. And certainly now with the pandemic and kind of the different changes that we're seeing in our lifestyle, some of us are getting a bit more sedentary. So if we're having sleep problems, that's another incentive to go out there and try to be active. What we want to target here is anything that will get your heart pumping. So we really want to focus on cardiovascular exercises. Lifting weights is never bad, but it's not necessarily going to be the type of exercise that's going to be helpful for your sleep. So we really want to try to get the heart pumping. So a light jog or going cycling at a fairly decent pace, going cycling at a fairly decent speed would be a good idea. Avoiding heavy meals late in the evening is another important trick to try to keep in mind. We know that as we're progressing towards the evening and the nighttime, our whole body adjusts to what should be in place for sleep. So that means that, for example, our metabolism is going down and our ability to digest a big steak, for example, is going down as well. So that's where a heavy meal before sleep will kind of be even more difficult to digest and could interfere with our ability to fall asleep and stay asleep afterwards. It's important to also watch our sleeping environment, so making sure that the bedroom is conducive to sleep in terms of the bed sheets, the pillow, the mattress, making sure that the room is dark, that the temperature is okay. We want to try to avoid overeating as well during the night because our temperature needs to go down in the body for us to be able to have good sleep. We also want to make sure that we maintain a constant sleep schedule. So watching that we keep our bedtimes and our wake up time as stable as possible, including on the weekends. And that is especially tricky if we're having sleep problems. It's tempting to try to sleep in a little bit on the morning if we have a good night at some stage, but this can be disruptive in the long term. So we really want to try to keep things as regular as possible. The alarm clock is another important one. So we typically recommend that people who are experiencing sleep problems try to turn the alarm clock away and try to push the phone away to not have any time cues. Because if you think of it, the time in the middle of the night is never bearer of good news. Either it's very early and we're getting discouraged at all these hours that we need to spend in the dark still before we can kind of move ahead and we're not sleeping and it's kind of frustrating, or it's too late and then we're starting to get really stressed because we had a poor night of sleep and then we'll have to face the day with feeling not that rested. So the clock is not really going to tell you any kind of good news in the middle of the night. So it's best to just kind of move it away and not be too stressed about time. And then it's important to try to avoid ruminating in bed and try to get in the right mind space before bedtime. And by that, concretely, I mean that it's helpful to plan at least 1 hour or even 2 if you can before going to bed, so that we can really kind of create some pre-sleep ritual, install a pleasant routine before sleep with regular steps to go through before bedtime, and make this kind of period of our day something that's very well structured, something very peaceful and relaxed, so that we can get into the right mind space. So protecting some me time before going to sleep is a good idea as well, so that we can afford to try to get in the right mind space for sleep. And I guess this is especially important now in the context of the pandemic, as many of us are spending a lot of time at home, and that those kind of boundaries between our work life and our kind of the rest of our life at home and our sleep as well, and both in terms of the time but also the environment. So staying, working at home, sometimes even in the bedroom. So we need to kind of create some clear boundaries that, okay, now I'm stopping to work, I'm stopping to do other types of activities, and I'm focusing on myself and getting ready for sleep. Another important factor to keep in mind is the biological clock that regulates our sleep, as well as a range of other physiological function. And I want to talk about that because I believe that's another important factor going on right now. So for most of us, that internal clock that's in our brain naturally tends to run a little bit late. And we know that based on experiments that we did before, where we put people initially in grottos. So we isolated people from the sun, from the outside world. And we found that most people, when left on their own in isolation like that, had a clock that revolved over a bit more than 24 hours. So on average, 24 and 18 hours. So just a tiny bit more than 24 hours. And what that does is that makes us always want to go to bed a bit later and wake up a bit later progressively day after day if we're not exposed to external cues. But when we're coming out of these grottos in normal life, what our biological clock does is that it grabs information from these external cues constantly to readjust itself on the external timing of the external world. And some examples of these external synchronizers are our meals, so the timing at which we eat, the timing at which we do different types of activities during the day, including exercise, for example, the timings at which we do social interactions, as well as the timings of our light exposure. And that's probably the most powerful synchronizer for our biological clock. So our clock is very sensitive to the light that we're surrounding to. And if you think of it, a lot of these factors are being altered by what we're going through right now with different levels of confinement and changes in our daily routine. Different aspects of the pandemic are really kind of putting us in a situation that's strangely similar to these grotto experiments, where we're a little bit cut off from the outside world and our usual ways of living. So a lot of us are staying at home, are being more isolating socially, are being a bit more sedentary in some cases. And we might not realize, but there's actually studies to show that the average lighting to which we're exposed indoors in our homes is even lower than what we're exposed in the average office as well. So there might be some decrements in our light exposure, and just the fact that we're not commuting and getting outside in the morning just for that short car drive to go to work might also kind of decrease some of those kind of external cues to our biological clock to realign itself with the 24-hour cycle of the sun that's out there. So in a nutshell, what we're seeing right now in terms of a lot of people, as we've said, that are kind of pushing back later their bedtimes and their wake-up times during the pandemic, that kind of gives us some hints that there might be something going off track with the biological clock. So a little bit like our internal clock is losing some of its anchors that we usually rely on to readjust it and keep a stable bedtime and wake-up time. So what do we do about that? One of the most impactful things that we can do to try to improve our biological clock and strengthen those signals is to improve our light exposure patterns during the daytime. Now, there's a lot of devices that we can use at home, like light boxes, for example, or these little light glasses that are coming on the market. But these can be helpful, but the simplest thing and perhaps the as efficient way of supplementing our light is to go outside and get some sunshine. Even on a cloudy day, we still have a lot of good light that we can get from natural source while going outside as compared to what we're exposed when we're staying indoors. And if you can, in addition to that, kind of adjust this with, accompany this with a light jog or some kind of physical activity to get your cardiovascular system going, then that's a bonus probably in terms of getting that dual signal to your biological clock that now is daytime, now is the time to be active. And that also helps the biological clock to kind of tick its timer so that it anticipates the next time at which you should be starting to secrete those sleepy hormones and falling asleep during the nighttime as well. And one critical point that I want to highlight here is that the timing at which we are getting exposed to light is very, very important. We want to boost our light in the morning, but we want to reduce the light exposure in the evening, because that's the normal time at which we naturally get to secrete our sleepy hormones like melatonin. And light will actively suppress melatonin. So all the TVs, tablets, smartphones, they're all mini lamps, if you think of it, that we're exposing ourselves to. So trying to, in that buffer period before sleep, trying to move away from these devices and trying to dim the lights a little bit to try to enable our natural melatonin, our natural sleepy hormones to resurface and flood our brain into a conducive state for sleep in preparation for what sleep happens. And that phenomenon, just to give you an idea as well, tends to happen about 2 hours before our usual sleep time. So hence the importance of trying to maintain a buffer period before the sleep period. But while saying all that, all these tricks can be very helpful for trying to protect and improve our sleep and maintain good sleep hygiene. But for some people, that might not be enough. For those who are struggling with more persistent, chronic, and severe sleep problems, even before we start with sleeping pills, the first recommended line of treatment for insomnia is called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, or CBTI. And I want to kind of talk a bit about that because a lot of people don't know about this, including some physicians. So it's good to raise awareness about that treatment because we know it's very efficient for a lot of people with insomnia. And to get a feel of how this works, we need to understand a little bit about how insomnia works. So in this figure here, you can see the severity of the insomnia symptoms as time progresses. And we know that everyone has some degree of predisposing factors, putting them at risk for insomnia, which you can see here in the in the green area. And these are mostly stable traits that do not change with time too much. We could be talking about, for example, just the fact of being female or just the fact of being a little bit older might put us more at risk for insomnia. So we all have these kind of different levels of predisposing factors. But then some event might happen in our life that could impact our sleep, for example, like a pandemic. So we'll call this a precipitating factor that will get our sleep problems across a certain threshold and make things worse from a sleep perspective. And while many people will kind of regain better sleep after that situation or that precipitating factor resolves, others might develop some bad sleep habits or unhelpful thoughts and preoccupations about their sleep, which will perpetuate their sleep problems over time. So that's what we call these perpetuating factors, which typically take the forms of bad behaviors around sleep or overly concerns about sleep, which ends up kind of taking control over our lives, and we're kind of always stressed, and we're having this anxiety, this performance anxiety about sleep, which kind of gets a bit blown out of proportion. And these two things, so the behaviors and the thoughts that are kind of perpetuating the sleep problems, are exactly what we will target in CBTI, or cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. And we do this by using very concrete behavioral strategies and active sleep manipulations to try to restore better sleep. So it's not the type of therapy of lay down on the couch and tell me about your mother. It's very kind of concrete changes that we make in behavior and sleep patterns. And this is typically done by a psychologist who's specialized in sleep. So if that might be a way that you would like to explore to try to get better sleep, that's a good idea to go and get professional help and guidance around this. So overall, to protect our sleep, if we try to wrap it up, in terms of sleep hygiene, it's very good important to try to maintain regular bedtimes and regular wake-up times. We want to try to be mindful of our alcohol, cigarettes, and nicotine consumption, because these are all factors that will influence our sleep. We want to try to avoid using electronic devices in bed or at bedtime, and trying to boost that cardiovascular exercise to try to release all of these endorphins, which will help us feel more sleepy during the nighttime as well. In terms of light, we can certainly use a light at our advantage by being mindful of the light to which we're exposed in the evening. And again, that includes all our electronic devices, and trying to boost morning light, ideally by going outside in the morning. And if sleep problems persist and become too chronic and disruptive for our daily lives, then it's important to try to seek professional help. And again, I would encourage you to try to seek people who are specialized in cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, or CBTI. And so some of the work that I've just shared with you today is still ongoing in terms of trying to understand how the pandemic is affecting people's sleep. And so if you do want to participate in that study, I'll invite you to share your experiences with us with that link here that's shown on the screen. These are important key resources as well if either from a mental health perspective or a sleep perspective, things are getting too difficult. The important thing is to seek help and talk about it. Thank you for your attention, and hope you sleep well.